Hi, shalom. I'm Brad Scott, and that's not really that important, but you are watching Worldviews in Collision as we continue our teaching series dealing with creation and evolution, and not just the fundamental differences between organic evolution or organic creation and so forth, but rather the theological aspects of it as well. And we've been covering some of the similarities. And some of these, I hope you can see as we go along, you can see the distinctions and the similarities between these two thinking processes. Now, first, let's begin with the concept of macroevolution. So, in your screen, we have basically a summation of what's called macroevolution, because there are microevolutionary processes taking place in the substance and evidence that we can see in our world. A butterfly and a caterpillar and things of that nature. Those are microevolutionary processes. But the same process, the reason why we call them micro, is because the same process happens over and over again. We see caterpillars into butterflies and so forth, but we continually see the process of caterpillars and butterflies. We don't see it going into anything else. What we're talking about primarily is macroevolution, and that is the teaching that natural upward, that would be beneficial, major changes in kind over billions of years, producing increasing and inheritable complexity, commonly known as molecules to man and so forth. And so we're talking about the macroevolutionary process is different from what we see going on when we see the evidences. And that's really what we want to address. And these things are going to be based upon the concept of genetics as well. In the 1800s, when we have Gregor Mendel coming on the scene and discovering through his investigation of pea pods and so forth, we began to get the understanding of genetics or genes and what we were made of and so forth, and how things multiply after themselves. And so Gregor Mendel comes along and puts a whole new twist, a reality, if you will, on how genetics work and how things take place. And so I submit to you that what we understand about how things are reproduced in our Bible or in our bodies, that was a Freudian, it totally contradicts the whole evolutionary theory as we see in genetics. Now, for example, up on your screen we see that Bereshit 1 verse 11 teaches us the whole concept of genetic information. There's 3 laws given in Genesis 3, 1 verse 11. The law of like kind begetting like kind, the seed is in the fruit, and the concept of multiplying after like kind. There's 3, come on back to me for a minute. Let's go back to these 3 laws again. In Genesis 1 verse 11, there are 3 laws. And those are natural laws that we see applied in the spiritual as well. They are seeing things that we can see with our eyes, and these are also true in the things that we cannot see. And so the 3 natural laws given in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 are simply this. Seeds are used to express in the Bible what produces and reproduces all living things. That's the word that the Bible uses to describe how living things, that would be plants and animals and people, how they reproduce after themselves, is with the seed. It's zerah in the Hebrew, a zayin, a resh, and an ayin. And that is the Hebrew word for translated as a seed. That's the first law. Now don't forget what a law is. According to hard empirical science, a law is something that always succeeds and never fails. If it always succeeds in established, confined conditions, tested over and over and over again, and always succeeds, that we call a law. And if it fails even once, it's called a theory. It has to remain a theory even if it fails once. If it fails a whole lot, it still remains in the area of a hypothesis. If it never worked in the first place, that we call evolution. And that's kind of the hierarchy of how these things work. And so the 3 laws, the seed is or all things are reproduced by a seed. That's the first law. Second law, lemenehu in the Hebrew. Lemenehu, translated as after their kind. is the second law. Like kind produces like kind. These are laws. These are the things that we can see happening over and over and over again. And the third law is that the seed is in the fruit. I submit to you that's the most important of the three laws. And that's an important concept to see in the whole teaching of the principle of the seed, which according to the scriptures and according to the parable, the seed is the word of God. Luke chapter 8 verse 11 and a commentary on the parable of the sower, the conclusion is this. The parable is this. Luke 8 verse 11. The seed is the word of God. And once you understand that the seed is in the fruit, then you begin to understand all the things that Paul said. I submit to you that you cannot possibly fully understand what Paul teaches in the book of Romans and Galatians if you do not understand the simple principle of the seed. And that's the reason why Shimon Kepha or Peter said that many things that Paul has to say are hard to be understood. Especially if you don't go back to the beginning, you're going to have difficulty in understanding why Paul teaches consistently on the concept of a seed. And so we have these three laws in the beginning. And we can see these laws operating in genetics and how we are made up in our bodies, how everything is made up is from our understanding of genetics. And so back to our screen here, the genetic information, like kind begets like kind, the seed is in the fruit, and the commandment to all those things he created just the way they should be in the beginning is go forth and multiply after yourself. This is the substance and the evidence that we see operating in our world. So all plants he created to be just exactly what they are, plants. Now go forth and multiply. All animals are created just the way they should have been created in the beginning. Now go forth and multiply after yourself. And all people were created just the way they should be in the beginning. Go forth and multiply after yourself. The only difference between the people and the plants is we are in the image of God and the plants and the animals are not. We are in the image of God. And so we can choose to turn away from our Creator. We can choose to do that. And so let me give you some examples of how these things work. First example, according to the laws of genetics and according to what Genesis chapter 1 says, you cannot get life from non-life. Okay? In our material world, you only have two choices that I can see. If you have a third alternative, please email me and let me know what it is, because scientists have been trying to figure this out for decades and decades, and that is simply this. Either in the beginning, either something came from nothing or something always was. We don't have really a third choice there. When we trace everything back to the very beginning, to that very point in time that started all things, if you will, we are either faced with something came from nothing, Big Bang, whatever they choose to call it, or something or someone always was. Now, from our three-dimensional human point of view, perhaps those are hard to understand. Either one of them is hard to understand. But in the beginning, you could not get life from non-life. Life produces life. Because in the genetic structure of non-life, there is no life information. So we have a non-life gene. And in that non-life gene, guess what? Is only non-life information. So we can't get life information out of non-life because there is no life information in it. Let me give you another example so we can understand what I'm saying. In the genetic structure of apes or monkeys, there is no man information. There is no Homo sapien information in apes and monkeys. So therefore you can't get man from apes and monkeys, because when you go back to the cells and the genetic information, there's no man info in there. And that's why you can't get that from that. Now once again, these are the things that we see with our eyes, and this is the substance and evidence that we're given in the scriptures and in our culture, in our life and everything around us. For example, you can't get birds from fish. Birds, fish could not have evolved, or things in the seas could not have evolved and with the little wings and birds and so forth, is because when we look inside the genetic information of a fish or a tadpole or etc., we see no bird info. And so because there's no bird information in there, we know that you can't get birds from fish. This is one of the evidences that convinced Dr. Francis Crick to conclude that, well, hey, based upon what we know about the laws of genetics, then life did not evolve on Earth. So that's why he had to run to the absurd, because he's avoiding the obvious. Now, the same is true next. In the Passover gene, if you will, there is no Easter information. In the genetics of Passover is only Passover information. So Passover will what? Produce another Passover, and another Passover, and another Passover. The Scriptures give us the information concerning Passover. So when we get to the New Testament, we see Yeshua observing the Passover. Why? Because Passover produces Passover. And so we cannot possibly have this appointed time, or this feast called Easter, coming forth from Passover. Easter and Passover are two totally different things. They have nothing to do with each other, because there is no Easter information in the Passover gene. Now, to give you another example, there is no Christmas information in Sukkot. When we go back to the feast, to the appointed time of Sukkot, we only have Sukkot information there. That 8 days you are to make yourselves booze, and these are the things you are to observe. These are my feast that contain my information, and my genetics, if you will, are in these feasts. And so when we can't possibly end up getting Christmas, because a lot of people believe that Christmas, the celebration of Christmas, comes forth from the Hebrew concept of Sukkot, and the idea of lights and so forth with Sukkot, and that's not true. They're two totally separate things. One did not come from the other. Let me give you another example. You can't get clean from unclean. Unclean gene only contains unclean information. And so unclean is going to beget unclean. And so if God created in the beginning a lobster or a crab or a pig, these are the popular ones, and they are unclean, then guess what? Lobsters, because they're unclean and designed that way, and God said, go forth and multiply after yourself, then lobsters are only going to produce more lobsters. Pigs are only going to produce more pigs. And you can't all of a sudden down the line, all of a sudden a pig is clean. Or all of a sudden a lobster is something clean, because there's no clean information in the lobster and in the pig. Now that's an important thing to grasp. Come back to me for a minute. That's an important thing to grasp, because we look at Peter's sheep, Peter's vision of the sheep, if you remember. That whole thing in Acts chapter 10 is maintaining what I'm telling you right now. It's perfectly consistent with the way God designed things in the beginning. How were things designed in the beginning? The unclean, the animals and the flowers and the trees and the fruit and so forth have not infused with choice. The difference between our cameraman here in the studio, Jared, the difference between Jared and a daffodil is that Jared is after the image of God and given the ability to choose. That's what makes him in God's image. That's what separates Jared from all the other aspects of the creation. Jared is given the ability to choose. Jared can get up in the morning if he wants to, and most people in the world do that right now, and say, God, take a hike. I'm going to do my own thing. Because that's what separates Jared from the flowers. However, daffodils don't have that choice. Flowers and trees and fruit and seeds, the daffodils get up in the morning and they don't have the ability to say, well, I ain't going to produce no fruit today. That's it. I'm tired of this. See, daffodils are created as daffodils. And daffodils will only produce another daffodil. That's the genetic structure of a daffodil. However, Jared is given choice, so he can do that. Now, with that in mind, that this is the way things are with animals and plants, but people can have the ability to choose to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so if I am an unbeliever and I choose to reject God, then I'm just going to produce unbelief in my life. But if I choose to receive the Father, if I choose to receive His salvation and His deliverance, God can change me because of my choice. I can become clean in His eyes because that's what separates me from flowers and animals and plants. Now we go back to Peter's vision of the sheep. And Cornelius, a God-fearer, we are told, made a decision to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he chose to follow Him and believe in Him. And so he's given a vision that there's going to be a man that's going to come to him. You know the story. That's going to be Peter. Now Peter doesn't know this. As you read on in Acts chapter 10, Peter does not know about Cornelius, who from a, if you will, Orthodox Jewish point of view is unclean. Why? Well, from an Orthodox point of view, because he did not convert to Judaism. Now that's the way the Orthodox see it. But God's trying to say to him, I'm the one that makes you clean. Not this religion, not this system. I'm the one that can take unclean with humans, because humans can choose. I'm the one that can make you clean. And so Peter's hanging out there one day, and it's lunchtime. It's time to eat. And at that lunchtime, he falls into a trance, if you remember, and he's given a vision. And the vision of is a sheet, a giant sheet, four-cornered sheet coming down with all kinds of clean and unclean animals and creeping things and fowl and so forth. Not people in the sheet, animals in the sheet. And the angel says to Peter 3 times, as a matter of fact, Peter, rise up and eat. And what does Peter say? He says, not so, for I have never eaten anything unclean. Now what did Peter just tell you right there? He had just spent 3.5 years with Yeshua and all the other disciples. And in that entire 3.5 year time, he did not eat anything unclean. That's what he just told you. The whole time I was with Messiah, we didn't eat anything unclean, because Yeshua never ate anything unclean. He's the one that knows that these things are unclean. And so he's telling you, I never did these things. And so Peter does not rise up and eat. Why? He doesn't understand the vision. He doesn't understand what it's trying to teach him. So when you read later on the text, when Peter does go to Cornelius, in the meantime, the Father has revealed to him what the vision was all about. And so he tells him when he meets Cornelius that God has taught me, what? Through the vision, that I am not to call Cornelius unclean, because God has made him clean. He didn't make the animals clean. That wasn't the purpose of the teaching of the vision. The teaching of the vision was to show him that Cornelius, on the other hand, because Peter did not rise up and eat, and Peter had never done that before, he's using something that they commonly understood in their culture to show him that I am God and Peter is a man, and that men can choose to follow me. So men can go from unclean to clean. Why? Because that's what separates man from the plants and the animals. So once again, when God creates things not to be eaten, in the genetic structure of that is only unclean information. So you can't get clean information out of unclean information, is what I'm trying to say. Now, you can't get Sunday from Shabbat. When we go back and we read about Shabbat, all the things about the Sabbath in the Bible, there's only Shabbat information in the genetic structure of that. And so that's the 7th day of the week, is the Shabbat, is the time that we rest. So you can't get any first day information out of the 7th day. It has to be a totally separate entity. And the same is true with the last one here, that, well, I thought we had something else here. I guess we don't. Let's go on. The letters of Ignatius in the 2nd century AD, with these things in mind about how genetics work, and that they will beget and after like kind and so forth. We learn from the letters of Ignatius in the 2nd century AD, here's what he says. He says, if then those who had lived in antiquated practices came to newness of hope, no longer keeping Shabbats, but living in accordance with the Lord's day. Now all of a sudden we have a major change. We have spontaneous generation, if you will, here, and a major change from the beginning, because all this time it's been Shabbat. Now all of a sudden it's something new, and in living in accordance with the Lord's day. Therefore, having become his disciples, let us learn to live in accordance with Christianity. Notice he didn't say the Bible. Notice he didn't say the scriptures. He said, let us learn to live in accordance with Christianity. It is utterly absurd to profess Jesus Christ and to practice Judaism. It is utterly absurd. Now, also notice a quote here, two different species, if you will. It's also a quote from Tertullian in his publication of An Answer to the Jews. He says, and I quote, "It follows accordingly that insofar as the abolition of carnal circumcision and of the old law is demonstrating as having been consummated at its specific time, so also the observance of Shabbat, or the Sabbath, is demonstrated to have been temporary." In other words, that appendage fell off. The Sabbath appendage, the circumcision appendage, they fell off and were replaced by other appendages. In essence, that's what we're saying theologically as we've come to understand this in organic evolution. In the Epistle of Ignatius to the Antiochians, notice he says this, and I quote, "These things I write unto you, you new olive tree of Christ." You new olive tree of Christ. Now remember what Paul taught in Romans chapter 11. That we of the wild olive tree are grafted in to the natural tree, which began as the seed in the very beginning. And that the branches and the flowers and the fruit of the natural tree comes forth from what was in the seed. The fruit will never contradict the seed. If the seed of the natural tree is an apple, then the fruit will be apples. And so when the wild olive tree, now obviously the seed was an olive, okay, that's why it's an olive tree. And we are grafted into them, so we all partake of the same nutrition and sustenance as the natural branches do. But what does he write? At least he's being honest here. "I write unto you, you new olive tree of Christ. Beware of those dumb dogs, those trailing serpents, those scaled dragons, those asps, those basilisks, those scorpions. For these are subtle wolves and apes that mimic the appearance of man." These are subtle wolves, and look what they call them. They call them apes that mimic the appearance of man. Now, who are they referring to here? Who is being referred to here? He's referring back to the ancient fathers and the practices of Israel, and everything in the Old Testament is what he's referring to. And is what is referring to those people as apes and monkeys, if you will, and subtle wolves that only mimic the appearance of men. Obviously, they haven't evolved to humans yet. How many times have we read in various publications over the decades how particularly two groups of people in our culture right now were called not even human? Afro-Americans or blacks, whatever you choose to call. They have been accused of that, and Jews in America. We have consistently, over this thinking process, called them something that's less than human. And as these apes and monkeys, they are only mimicking the appearance of men because they haven't quite evolved to that. And since our culture sees someone Afro-American producing another Afro-American and so forth, then the assumption is that these guys are keeping the evolutionary process from progressing. And so we have to get rid of them. And that's been the background of racism, and racism evolving into actually killing, hanging them from trees, putting them in gas chambers, and so on and so forth. We've been doing this based upon an evolutionary thought process from the very beginning. We've been doing this. And I submit to you that this is mainly because the natural process of evolution preceded our spiritual understanding of that. And that whole thing started in the very beginning, that was taught to us in Isaiah chapter 14, I quoted earlier. as Isaiah revealing to us that it was the enemy's desire to progress upward, thinking that he could become God someday through a progressive process. And that we have shown that in the natural, and that has just morphed right into the spiritual ideal. And this is one of the reasons for our dividing of ourselves and racism in this country, racism all over the world, not just in this country, because of this thinking process. Now, the next time that we come back together here in our next broadcast, I'm going to now take you into what is called the so-called geologic column. The so-called geologic column is a various stratas that we supposedly see in our Earth that contains a picture of simple organisms evolving into more complex organisms as you get to the top of this geologic column. And I'm going to show you that the whole concept of dispensationalism also it was patterned after this same thing. So there's a direct relationship between the so-called geologic column and the dispensational column as we kind of lay those side by side. And so that's what we're going to talk about next time as we continue to investigate the significant differences between creation and evolution, and how important it is to see that we need to stand up against this in the latter days. We need to be able to give an answer to every man that asks us of the hope that is in us. We need to be able to give a response. And I think it's high time that we start teaching each other this as well. So in the meantime, till I see you next time, cling to your roots that your days may be long, and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. We'll see you next time. Shalom. Bye.